This is going to be a little different than the usual fireside chats. I wanted to explore some of the influences that made me who I am today. Unfortunately, one of the biggest was bullying. Kind of a downer to talk about, but I'm hoping that sharing my thoughts on the topic might help some of you. The first experience many of us have with bullying is often from our own parents spanking us because they didn't have the time or the energy to explain what we did wrong or why their way is right. In doing so, they inadvertently taught us that violence and intimidation are good ways of getting what you want. That's not what they meant by it, and if they knew that's what we would internalize from the experience, I like to believe that they would think a little harder and find another way to communicate the urgency of what they wanted. But my dad didn't have the luxury of high-minded parents who explained their reasoning. He had a mean drunk dad who beat him. I appreciate more and more as I age all the restraint he showed in never outright beating me, not wanting to continue that cycle. He did paddle my ass on occasion or twist my arm from the front seat while driving, but that's the worst I ever got. That's because he wanted to do better by me than his father did by him, so I might do even better by my own kid someday. He couldn't control what happened outside the house, however, so I would soon become acquainted with human cruelty despite his best efforts. It didn't start in grade school, though. I was regarded as a weird kid. But there were a lot of weird kids, all of us being at an age when it was acceptable to still be testing the limits and trying stuff out. That stopped being the case around middle school. Everybody suddenly got extremely fucking self-conscious and hypercritical of one another. I would assume as a smokescreen for their own insecurities. At any rate, this is where I learned the second of many bad lessons from my youth, that there is a social ladder you cannot climb without kicking others down a rung. It was a perverse sort of game that I soon reverse engineered the rules to by observation. Finally, something programmatic and game-like for me to memorize and then min-max. Problem was, it only works that way in middle school and high school, becoming profoundly maladaptive in college and beyond. It was easy enough to learn the rules of that game, but very hard to forget about it. What I learned from that ruthless pecking order was a sort of hypercritical, fault-seeking perspective that looks for any weakness to ridicule and exploits it. Even now, I can't just enjoy anything. I pick it apart looking for cringe. When I brainstorm ideas for writing, I'm helpless but to view all my ideas from the perspective of the most uncharitable critic possible, someone who hates me, wants to hurt me, and is looking for anything in my ideas he can use to do that. I liked who I was before the bullying, even if I was a silly, spastic mess sometimes. I lost a lot of qualities I used to like about myself, surgically removing and burning them in order to become a more defensible person. This is how being bullied often turns people into their own bully. One there's no escape from, as they live in your head with you, constantly criticizing everything you think and do, always probing your seams in search of weak points from which to pry you apart. Not just you either. From this perspective, every new person you meet looks like a potential enemy rather than a potential friend. In doing so, you worsen your social isolation by sabotaging opportunities to build new connections. If life were an RPG, this would be a permanent status affliction. It's a lot of stress that never lets up, and it ages you prematurely. I had gray hair at my temples in my 20s, along with a gastric ulcer. Similar symptoms were found in a study measuring cortisol levels in monkeys of the lowest social status in their group. We are social animals who need to belong and suffer in many invisible ways when we can't. Suicidal ideation was so normalized for me that I found it difficult, and still find it difficult, to believe it isn't just a widespread thing that happens to people, regardless of what's going on in their lives. Now I understand it feels that way to me, because it's always present for me, regardless of whether things are going well or poorly, because it's a lasting scar from past experiences that's unconnected to anything happening now. I bought a gun at a party when I lived in Florida. This guy got a revolver out and was showing it around to impress people or something. I didn't realize buying it was even on the table until somebody offered him $50 for it. I had to bike to the bank, but afterwards I had my very own unlicensed firearm, which I never did anything with. It sat in a shoebox on the shelf in my closet for the next 2 years until I left Florida. I was already stuck in Florida as a consequence of a failed relationship, so I was in a dark place and hurting bad. I wanted a guaranteed foolproof way out, just to have it at the ready in case things ever got truly unbearable. It exerted a weird influence on me. Simply having taken one step towards suicide made the attraction stronger, like magnets pulling on each other more the closer they get. It would sort of whisper to me as I lay in bed at night, bargaining with me, trying to persuade me of the merits of death. Death is rent-free. 0 utility bills, too. No insurance to pay, no groceries to buy, no appointments to keep, no deadlines to deal with. It's the ultimate in pragmatism to solve all life's problems by not being alive. I'm still here in part because I'm a coward. I was always too frightened to actually rip off the Band-Aid and get it over with. But also because I was introduced to psychedelics in Florida and was able to obtain my own supply shortly after moving away. I thought, if I'm going to die anyways, then before I go, I may as well have some remarkable experiences that I'd be too afraid to try otherwise. If nothing else, they may open up a new, as yet unexplored avenue of escapism. But as anybody who has tried them will tell you, psychedelics are not an escape from your problems, but a constructive confrontation with them. It abruptly and radically changed the trajectory of my life in the way I guess finding religion does for some people. Where before I was trapped in a slow but inexorable downward spiral, psychedelics blasted me the fuck out of the toilet bowl and back into the sunshine, showing me that life is ugly, but it's beautiful too, and the beauty makes the ugliness worth it. Often you can't have one without the other. Like natural selection producing unparalleled beauty in living things, but also requiring a great deal of death in order to work. Or when there's a turd on the sidewalk, but there's also a flower growing out of it. Luckily, it turns out you can love and hate something at the same time. Psychedelics unfuculated many of the scars bullying left on my brain, but even though I'm hopeful now and desire what life has to offer, I'm still afraid all the time. I still experience suicidal ideation, but I have a good handle on that particular demon now. I know all its tricks and it has no power over me. The remaining scars continue to manifest in subtler ways. I remember a lovely young woman, I won't name here, who was a great friend I, at times, shared a bed with when I lived in Florida. On one of those occasions, she remarked to me that I was tense and needed to relax. I didn't understand what she meant. She massaged my shoulders and said I should relax and loosen up my muscles, that I was tensed up all the time, like I was on high alert or something. I didn't realize that. It's just how I always carried myself, and I assumed it was normal. I was just being me, existing in a bed, being lovingly touched by a beautiful person, not knowing there was a wrong way to do that. I was as frigid and rigid on the outside as I felt internally. And if there's one thing women find most repellent in a man, it's emotional distance. Consequently, for every successful romance I've had, there were 2 that went nowhere. All of this is emphatically not a plea for pity. The first actual useful thing I learned about being bullied that wasn't an empty platitude is that nobody cares because they have their own problems. Aside from leaning into sympathy not being a path to personal growth, you shouldn't expect strangers to be invested in your emotional well-being the way that you and your loved ones are. It's not that they're uncaring people, they just don't know you. That's an important but difficult lesson to learn for someone with no theory of mind who got through life up until that point by assuming neurotypical people around me just knew everything I knew, because they always seemed to just know what I'm feeling, even when I thought I was doing a good job of concealing it. Another important lesson is that strangers know nothing of your background. Some of the worst bullying of my youth came from creationist classmates at a fundamentalist private school where I stubbornly defended evolution until I got tired of being punished for it by staff and students alike. For a long time, I felt like I had a score to settle with Christians in general. The people who hurt me were Christians. They hurt me for reasons directly related to their beliefs. So, Christians had to pay. Because the ones directly responsible were out of my reach by that time, I instead looked for people with the same belief system as a proxy for punishment. That was a wrong-headed and pain-driven reaction. Purely retaliatory, I figured I'm within my rights to treat the world the same way it treated me. Problem being, of course, that the world, as I meant it, is actually billions of incredibly varied people from all kinds of backgrounds with all kinds of beliefs and feelings. Every one of them as real as me, all of which have been hurt before, many much worse than I have. When I would go out of my way to demean Christians I'd just met because other different Christians had done it to me, they don't know that. They've never met me before. They don't know what I've been through. They just know this weird stranger is being rude for no reason, as from their perspective, it's unprovoked. The particulars of my experiences at that school probably aren't very relatable to most people, but I feel like what I learned from it can be generalized productively. I see a lot of people who persist in racial hatred because of bad experiences they had with kids of another race during a tender, vulnerable time in their lives. You may also have noticed the current popularity of women on social media condemning the entire male half of humanity because of a pattern of bad experiences that they had with individuals. Or men punishing every woman they meet because of what an ex-girlfriend did. People like this go through life always looking to get even somehow, and because they can't get a hold of those actually responsible, they miss the trees for the forest and attack the group instead, picking out anybody who looks like them or in some way represents what they represent as the punishment proxy. That doesn't stop bullying, though. It perpetuates it. You just wind up creating more guys like you looking to get even, willing to settle for punishing similar-looking proxies if they can't get a hold of you. My father knew better than to perpetuate cycles of violence, and thanks to him, so do I. It feels self-justifying to be exactly as nasty as the world makes you, but there's a sneaky lie hiding in there, that you don't have any agency in that process. That you're powerless to decide who you're going to be, with no choice but to let the world sculpt you into its likeness. We all decide who we're going to be, moment to moment. We're influenced by our experiences, but we're also metaconscious, able to examine the effects of those influences on us, and whether we like them or not, incorporating or discarding them accordingly. I really, really hate to mention Star Wars in all of this. But even after committing to a life of evil deeds, Anakin was able to do a 180 when it mattered most, because he wanted to be a good father more than he wanted to be a Sith Lord. He consciously went against everything his life experiences conspired to turn him into. We all have that power, even if we sometimes pretend not to. Looking back, I may have brought much of the bullying on myself. I was an obnoxious know-it-all with diminished awareness of how others saw me. Through the more charitable eyes of an adult, I now see the kids who hurt me were themselves incomplete human beings who, like me, had not yet developed virtues like patience, tolerance, or empathy. The actual solution, which every hurt person knows but will not always admit, is not to become like those kids when they were at their worst, but instead to become the sort of person you wish they had been. If enough people do this, the next kid like you won't have such a rough time. Letting bullies decide for you who you're gonna be is their final victory over you. It's how they reproduce, through self-perpetuating cycles of trauma and unhealthy reactions to it. Your final victory over bullies is simply to not make any more of them. It's not very gratifying, is it? You've stopped the cycle of bully creation, but the ones who hurt you still got away with everything. They had their fun at your expense, and now they're off in their best lives, maybe starting families, running businesses and whatnot. Where's the justice in that? Naturally, that leads one to want to create their own justice, which is just a euphemistic way to describe revenge. Revenge and justice are similar. Many people today can't tell the difference between them. The distinction is very subtle. In my mind, at least, revenge is inflicting equal and opposite harm, while justice is putting everything back the way it was before. Revenge seems like a good idea in the moment. It seems self-justifying. Oftentimes I've laid awake at night wondering how I can live out the rest of my life without any sort of payback. Just the knowledge that people who hurt me continue to live without any sort of consequences whatsoever is unbearable. It diminishes my enjoyment of every aspect of life. I was told at the time that the best revenge is living well, and time heals all wounds. Both of those are false. These days, you wind up financing your bully's life with your tax dollars, even if you're very successful and your bully is homeless or living in poverty. As for time healing all wounds, the pain diminishes over time, but it never goes away. Would getting revenge close that wound? It's hard to say. I didn't choose that path. I suspect very strongly if I had taken some sort of violent revenge, I would have felt very good while it was happening, but then I would have felt very stupid in prison. Like maybe for the first 2 or 3 days, I'd still be basking in the afterglow of endorphins from what I had done, but then day 4 would come, and then day 5, the first week, the second week, the first month, then a year would go by. Eventually, I would start to regret what I had done, because after everything's over, you're just left sitting in a concrete cell with your cellmate, Darnell, adding a couple new lanes to your Hershey Highway every night. You'd start to feel a little bit stupid, like maybe you made the wrong choice. So that got me to thinking, well, what other avenues for satisfaction are there? Somebody needs to pay. I don't want to punish random people. I understand the folly in doing so. But the specific people who hurt me need to pay some sort of price. And I realized that they will experience tremendous suffering just simply by being alive. There are some forms of pain and hardship everybody experiences as part of the human experience. Some examples of this include losing a beloved pet, heartbreak when you get dumped, losing a sibling to a violent death, premature death, watching your parents grow old and die, especially to cancer. That's a really brutal and awful thing to experience, both for the patient and anyone who loves them. I confess, for the briefest moment, this line of thinking brought me some measure of comfort. But a funny thing happened the more I contemplated it. Just all the ways that we all unavoidably suffer by being human. I realized, hey, wait a minute, I am one of those. I've had many of those experiences. I've lost a beloved pet twice. I've lost a sibling to a premature violent death. I'm going to watch my parents die of old age without realizing it, and it was quite an unwelcome feeling at the time, since I really wanted to be angry. I had painted myself into a corner of sort of accidentally humanizing and empathizing with the people who hurt me. That was an important epiphany for me and a healing moment. In the attempt to stay angry and to sort of roast myself alive in my own negative emotions, to luxuriate in anger, I instead passed through the full spectrum of human emotions and circled back to empathy at the end. That was some bitter medicine. At the time, although it was good for me, I did not want that conclusion. I wanted vindication. I wanted a justification for my anger. I went searching for examples of bullied people committing some sort of act of revenge against their bullies. I went in with the assumption, wishful thinking, I guess, that most examples of school violence were bullied kids snapping and lashing out against their tormentors. And that's not what I found for the most part. I found a couple of examples where that was a factor. I found only 2 where the retaliation was proportional, where they only targeted the specific individual or individuals who harmed them. In every other case, there were a bunch of innocent bystanders who were just there, who were targeted opportunistically, which is not justice by any stretch of the imagination. As angry as I was, I couldn't go along with that. I couldn't find any evidence in those examples for the narrative that I wanted to believe in. And I guess, in retrospect, that was the wrong direction to move in the first place. None of that was healing. None of that got me past my trauma. It just kept me stuck in that space of contemplating it and just cycling it through my brain over and over. I think that's why they say that anger is an acid which does more to damage the vessel you put it into than anybody that you might throw it on. So what does that leave you with in the way of options? Can't go around hurting random people. That's not the way. You can never find and punish the specific people who hurt you unless you want to spend the rest of your life rotting in prison. Even schadenfreude is off the table. I figured out on my own that the right answer was to focus on healing That's where my definition of justice comes in, just emotional reconstruction to undo the damage that they caused. What I struggled with was figuring out if there was anything constructive I could do with all this anger I had left over. I had nowhere to put it. It had plenty of self-destructive applications, but that's what I had been looking into until that point, and while very gratifying to contemplate, it was also slowly killing me. What worked for me was to put those feelings into artwork. In my case, writing. I'm a prolific author of horror because, they say to write what you know, and I've known a lot of horror in my life. What I discovered in the process is how incredibly therapeutic writing can be. In the same way that in fables like Rumpelstiltskin, to name a demon gives you power over him, I feel the same is true of naming your traumas. To put them onto the page gets them out of your head somewhat and lays them bare. There was also unexpected healing to be found in sharing all of this with others and receiving feedback, discovering that my experiences were not unique, that I was not as alone as I felt, and that my experiences as a human being overlapped much more than I ever thought with other people I'd never met. That experience made me feel more like part of humanity than anything else ever has. The other thing I found out is that strong emotion is the juju that makes for really great artwork. It's the secret sauce and where the power behind powerful artworks comes from. It's what makes them compelling. It can be any emotion. Art is one of the few areas of life in which negativity is well received. People watch horror movies all the time. People listen to sad songs all the time. There's really no way to do art wrong unless people who are reading it or listening to it or viewing it feel nothing. As long as you make people feel something, then you've succeeded as an artist. How about that? Pain is power, it turns out. It's the fuel that we burn for our journey of life. And like damn near anything else in this country, it can be monetized if you know how. I'll leave you with this. When life gives you lemons, you've got some choices. You can eat the lemons, you can throw the lemons back and damn the consequences, or you can set up a lemonade stand and profit from your pain.